Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about the Black Plague, or the bubonic death of 1347 to 1351. What caused the Black Death? Okay. Our culprits here are little tiny fleas which lived on rats and carried the disease itself. You'd never think that something that small could wreak such havoc. Some of the causes that made people susceptible to this disease was a famine of 1315 to 1317. Okay. By 1300, Europeans were farming almost all the land they could cultivate. A population crisis developed. Europe during that time period becomes overpopulated and they don't have enough food. Climate changes in Europe produced 3 years of crop failures between the years 1315 to 1317. They had too much rain, which caused the crops to be less than productive, or in some cases unproductive at all. At this time, as many as 15% of the peasants in some English villages died, and in many areas, numbers were very similar. One consequence of the starvation and poverty was a susceptibility to disease. As human beings, anytime we don't get the appropriate nutrients and food, our bodies become weaker and more susceptible to any diseases which may come and try to harm us. In 1347, the plague reaches Constantinople. At this point, the disease is carried by the Mongolian Golden Horde, and they reach the city of Kaffa in 1346. In that battle, the diseased bodies of Mongolians are launched over the walls of the city and into the population. As the battle reaches its end, those that have survived hop onto boats, and as you can see here, they're going to travel to Europe and carry the disease with them. The symptoms. You knew you had the plague, you would get this bulbous would show up on your lymph nodes, sometimes in the neck, the armpits, or the groin area. And the septemic form had almost 100% mortality rate. If you got this type of the plague, things were not looking too well for you. This is a picture of people from the Toggenburg Bible in 1411, just showing the different sores you would get all over your body and the several days before you would die from the disease. Some of the attempted cures were to lance the boils, and they took a sharp metal device, sometimes heated it up, and they figured if they could stick it into the wound, open the wound up, and drain it of the fluid inside, that would cure them of the disease. In all these cases, this just proved nothing but a painful way to die. The disease cycle. The fleas would drink the rat blood that carried the bacteria. The bacteria would multiply in the flea's gut. The flea's gut would be clogged with bacteria, and then the flea bites a human, regurgitates the blood into the human wound, and the human becomes infected. In most cases, the human doesn't even realize that they've become infected. Okay. Medieval art at the time becomes saturated with images of death, dying, and disease, because the people at the time were surrounded so much by death, dying, and disease. You can see here the angels of death wreaking havoc on the people of Europe. Okay. People at this time period were surrounded by death on an almost daily basis here. Some cities were decimated to the point where they ceased to exist for a certain time period. People were, brought their bodies out, laid them in the streets. Entire families would be found dead inside their houses, and the disease really changed the way people lived. Medieval art and the plague. There becomes an obsession with death here. It almost dehumanized the people of Europe at the time because death surrounds them so much and so often. As the old saying went, the victims ate lunch with their friends and dinner with their ancestors, because the disease progressed so quickly that where you could be fine on a Thursday or a Friday afternoon, by the weekend you could be ill and possibly die within 3 or 4 days. Okay. As you can see here with the map, This shows the progression, sometimes slow, sometimes a little quicker, of the plague at this point. The disease comes here from Central Asia to the city of Kaffa, which we talked about earlier. From there, it travels down into Sicily, Messina, Sardinia, Corsica, and people at the time realized there was something wrong, but they didn't realize the magnitude of the disease. From then, it travels more quickly by boat, and they sail to ports along Italy, France, and as you can see here by this brown shaded area here, this is the first major progression of the disease. From there, you get to the light yellow, dark yellow here as the disease starts to spread farther up. And this is all within a matter of a couple of years, which is quite impressive because there's no mass transit and really no way to get around other than a horse or by walking if you weren't going to travel by boat. You can imagine what this disease would do today with our modern forms of transportation. You also see here that in some areas, this light blue, here and here, that there was very few plague outbreaks, and there's different theories as to why. Some of these areas are more isolated, and so the disease couldn't be spread as quickly, and other areas kept people out of their cities, kept people who didn't belong in their cities out, and therefore the disease wasn't spread. There was all sorts of misinformation as to how the disease was spread. Some people thought that it was a curse from God, and there was really nothing you could do by it because of it. Different attempts to stop the plague. As you can see here, doctors tried different things. They wore masks, they had robes, they tried to leech people in some cases where they take the leeches and they figured that the disease was in the blood, so they put the leeches onto the body and the leech would take the disease out of the body. Again, these would do nothing more than to make a dying person suffer. Attempts to stop the plague. There were a group of people that were called Phlegontelli, and they believed that if they punished themselves, that they would be taking away this curse from God. So they traveled from town to town, holding processions to the towns, whipping themselves, often causing great pain to them, and thought that they could take this curse away by inflicting the pains on themselves. Another artistic image here, you've got death traveling to town to town here, and this is really what people thought of. You know, they lived in constant fear of this disease for quite a time period. Mortality rate of this disease. Okay, again, these statistics are probably not as accurate as we'd like them to be because of the time period here in record keeping, but we believe that anywhere between 35 and 70% of anyone who was infected with this disease died, and that accounts to about 25 million people in just this short period. The plague is going to come back in other times. It's going to come back again later in the 1400s, again in the 1500s, and in some places in the world still exists today. Not a disease that had little effect. This disease really changed the way people lived. Okay. So what were the political, economic, and social effects of the Black Death? Politically, it had a huge effect because this was an equal opportunity killer. This disease infected and killed kings, lords, dukes, and in some cases even popes. Economically, it had an effect because it killed such a huge percent of the population that the workforce of Central Europe really had to be restructured. And socially, it just saturated generations of people with images of death and dying, and really changed the way that people live their lives here. Black Death, or the plague, is probably one of the most influential things to have happened to Central Europe in the Middle Ages. Hopefully this helps you and you've enjoyed this.